Oh, are we recording? Sorry, I was reading some very good reading material. It is I, Mr. Lewis, your teacher here with you today. This is our Chapter 4, Section 3, Natural Selection in Action video. On board on your screen right there, you go ahead and see your bell ring. You know what to do by now. That is a beautiful thing. Go to edmodo.com and answer your little bell ringer there. Are you ready? Because I'm ready to get this started with you today. Guess what? We have two objectives today. First is to give two examples of how natural selection can result in adaptation that helps an organism survive. And then we're going to outline the process of speciation. So let us begin, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we all know, going through natural selection, that there are changes in populations and they happen for different reasons. Okay, one of the things, the theory, that's right there, I'll let you go to read that. Now, remember that the theory of natural selection is simply this: survival of the fittest. The best organism that's best suited for that environment is going to be the ones that's going to be the most likely to survive and reproduce. All right, the ones that are best adapted, well adapted, best adapted, those species or those individuals are going to be the ones, that species, to reproduce and continue on the species. Now, there are adaptations from hunting. Now, when we talk about natural selection says that predators can have an effect on that species. Remember, in overproduction, it produces, like that spider, 500 to 1,000 eggs, and then it goes through the next step, which is, the weaker and slower rabbits were the ones who were getting eliminated. All right, that kind of thing happens because of adaptations from hunting, because of whether it's us as predators, hunting them, or other predators hunting those organisms. That helps change organisms. Well, we're going to talk about one example today, and what you see on the board on the screen there is about the Uganda elephant. All right, now Uganda is a country on the continent of Africa, and it has an elephant. Now, in Uganda, there was two types of elephants. There was one elephant that had the tusks that were made of ivory, and there was an elephant that did not have tusks. Now, because back in the early days, that ivory was very, very valuable because the hunters could make a lot of money off of it, they would hunt elephants just for their tusks. They would go ahead and go out there, attack, and kill those elephants only so they could get those tusks. They could sell the ivory of those tusks and make a killing on it, make a fortune on it. Well, what ended up happening is that those elephants that did not have tusks were not hunted. Well, which elephants do you think were able to survive and reproduce? The ones without the tusks. The ones without the tusks were able to survive and reproduce and pass on that trait to their offspring. So now in Uganda, when at one time there was more elephants with tusks, now there's more elephants without tusks. They're tuskless elephants because they're not being hunted. They don't have the tusks there. The other bad thing about that is these hunters, these poachers, when they would kill these elephants, is they would only take the tusk. It's one thing if they were going to go kill the elephant so they could eat it and use all the meat and use all the bones for different things. But the only thing they wanted, they would go out and literally kill these elephants just for those tusks. Now, because of that, there are fewer tusked elephants and more tuskless elephants in Uganda because of that poaching of that ivory trade. Now, we talked about this also. We talked about insecticide resistance. Now, what is insecticide resistance? Again, that's simply the fact that some insects are not affected by an insecticide. So you spray the insecticide, psh, the little bugs over here, they get sprayed with the insecticide. They're like, oh, I'm taking a bath, and they run off. Other insects are like, psh, and they die. Okay, well, the ones that just run off, they're the ones who are able to reproduce. And when they reproduce, they pass on that genetic information to their offspring, and their offspring then are now insecticide resistant or resistant to that insecticide. Now, why does that happen? Why is it possible for insects to do that, to be able to be resistant to those things? Well, they have something in their genes that allows them to be resistant to whatever it is that's going to kill them in that insecticide. But another thing that helps these insects is the fact that they have a very, very, very short generation time. Now, when we talk about generation time, we're talking about the average time between one generation and the next. Okay, and insects, we're talking literally weeks. Okay, some of them we're talking months, some of them were, but we're mainly talking weeks and days, generation time for these insects. Okay, for humans we're talking like I think it's like 15 years or 20 years is a generation, but for these insects it's like days and weeks, and all of a sudden a new generation is born, a new generation is raised. All right, that is a reason why insecticide resistance is so prevalent with these insects, and why these insecticide manufacturers have to change these insecticides all the time, change the formulas all the time, while the farmers have to use different insecticides all the time, so that way they can make sure they get all of the insects, not just a couple of them. All right. Now, here's a picture so you guys can see what I was just talking about. They sprayed the pesticide, pshaw, and these 3 died. This one lives. And when this one lives, it goes back, it reproduces with other ones that have lived, and it passes on that trait to its offspring. And then its offspring come back, and guess what? Because it has a very short generation time, they're able to multiply, multiply, multiply. And so then when you spray them with that pesticide again, they're able to live. And it's simply because they have such a short generation time, they're able to pass on that gene to their offspring. And guess what? There you go. All right. And there you go. Now, there's also competition for mates. So survival of individuals does not guarantee survival of species. That is a very important thing to understand. Just because a species lives and all the way through to its adulthood and lives and dies of a ripe old age does not mean that that species is going to survive. That species, that individual has to be able to reproduce. All right. If that individual can't find a mate to reproduce with, or that individual has birth defects for whatever reason and is not able to reproduce, well, guess what? That species will die. So just because a species goes from infant and reaches adulthood and eventually passes away from old age, that does not guarantee the survival of the species. They have to be able to breed and reproduce successfully in order for that to happen. Now, the competition for mates, that is an important thing also that happens, that with these animals. That these animals, that the females or the males, just depend on the species, the females look for that ideal version of the male to reproduce, to have the best chance of reproduction, have the best chance of successfully continue on that species. Now, how do new species form? How are new species formed? Well, the formation of a new species is called speciation. All right, and this speciation happens in 3 basic steps. You have separation, you have adaptation, and you have division. So there's 3 basic steps that happens in this process called speciation. Over here, the first step is separation. That's where the organisms were all together, and then one of them goes off for whatever reason, whether it flies off on its own or a storm blows it away or whatever happens. But for whatever happened, one of those original species flies off and is on its own, or leaves and is on its own. All right. The next thing is adaptation. And after separation, adaptation, that organism then has to be able to adapt to the environment, its new environment, to be able to attain food. Just like we were talking about those finches on the Galapagos, that those finches that were able to attain the food because of the shape of it and structure of its beak, those organisms were able, those finches were able then to continue to live and survive, reproduce. Now, here is a little diagram so you guys can see. And this is kind of how we think of how the Galapagos Islands finches, how they were created. So you had the original bunch. All right. They were over here in Ecuador. They got blown offshore, or they flew offshore, whichever happens. But Darwin believes that a storm happened and blew all these finches over here to the Galapagos Islands. So they land over here in the Galapagos Islands. This is the separation part. And when they get here, they have to be able to obtain food. So those that can obtain food, those are the ones who survive and reproduce. The ones who can't, those die off, those traits die off. That is the adaptation part. Well, then those birds over here, those finches on this island, decide, hey, we're going to fly somewhere, and they fly over to this next island. When they get to the next island, again, that is separation happening again. They get to this next island. Those finches that left this island that now came to the second island, they have to be able to adapt to get the food on that island. And those that have the best adaptations, those will be able to continue on and get food there. That would be adaptation again. Then some of those finches from this island flew back to this island, but when they came back here, they discovered they could not interbreed. In other words, they could breed, but they would not be able to produce fertile offspring. They have to be able to produce fertile offspring for it to be the same species. Since they could not produce fertile offspring, this is where the division happens, and that happens all over. And over here, step 6 just shows you that it can happen over and over and over and over again. Now, that is the last step, is division. All right, and that's when these two separate groups can no longer mate and create a fertile offspring, an offspring that can reproduce as well. When it can no longer interbreed, it is a new species. All right, and that is the end. That is when new species are formed. Now, if we look at frogs, now this here is another example, so you can see these are 4 examples of frogs. You have the leopard frog, the tree frog, the pickerel frog, and the bullfrog. Now, these are all frogs, and you would think all frogs could mate. Well, the reason that these frogs can't mate and why these are 4 different species is because when they are actually able to mate. All right. If you notice here, this is the mating behavior. This is when they really are at the top of their game and ready to reproduce. Well, guess what? The leopard frog is not able to reproduce at the same time as the other 3. And same thing with any of these. None of these are able to reproduce at the same time. Since they're not able to reproduce at the same time, then that means that those organisms, if the bullfrog mated with the tree frog, guess what? It's not going to produce anything, because the bullfrog is, when he's ready to mate, the tree frog is not ready to mate. His body's not ready for that yet. So that's an example of what we're talking about, how they become different species, because they can't mate together. Guess what? It is your 4.3 section review. It's review time. It's time for the review. Go ahead and read it. Take down your notes. You guys will love it. I know you will. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed that. This is your 4.3 section review. This is me, Mr. Lewis, going ahead and signing off with you. Remember that I'll be thinking about you guys, and if you have any questions, again, you can always post them up on Edmodo or ask me in person, whichever you'd like to do. And remember that I'll be seeing you in the future.